Ahoy, you salty sailors. Time to raise anchor and set sail for your best scrawny life. Arrgh.
Well, I slept in and missed the morning bite, but fortunately there was an afternoon rally that day. Unfortunately, the week that followed this weekend was very hot and dry, heat indices well over 100 degrees. Since then, the temperature came down a little bit, but there has been no rain now for several weeks. The result of that hot weather was a fish kill at Lake Red Rock that seemed to fall hardest upon the larger specimens of each species, and it really took out a bunch of the large wipers. But there were large fish of every species: big flathead catfish, big mouth buffalo, grass carp, but yeah, a lot of wipers as well. Why it was harder on the largest fish probably has something to do with the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water, as temperatures in the shallows just got higher and higher and higher. The fish probably went deeper, but the lake may have been partially stratified, so the larger fish may have encountered a layer in the water column where the dissolved oxygen was less than their requirement for survival. And the smaller fish for now seem to be following a pattern of staying deep during the heat of the day, with bursts of feeding activity at dawn and dusk. I was in the lower section of the lake down by the dam and did not see any foam or any sign of a blue-green algae bloom, but it is quite possible that the upper sections of the lake could be experiencing a blue-green algae bloom, which would further deplete the oxygen level and possibly contribute bacteriotoxins as well. Blue-green algae is also known as cyanobacteria, and they are present in all of Iowa's water bodies naturally in small amounts. In order to cause an explosion in their numbers, which is called a blue-green algae bloom or a cyanobacteria bloom, you need two things: hyperfertility and a long stretch of sunny days of intense solar energy input. The hyperfertility is probably coming when fertilizers and other agrochemicals are applied to farm fields, a small amount of which will dissolve and run off into ditches and creeks and eventually wind up in the Des Moines River. The forecast calls for yet another week of hot, sunny weather, not a chance of rain, and heat indices over 100 degrees. So things are going to get even worse. I haven't been on any of the rivers in the interior part of the state lately, but I would imagine the smaller rivers are probably reduced to little more than a trickle at this point, and there are probably fish kills going on for all of the river's most vulnerable species. Those would include predatory fish that typically have a more northerly distribution, like northern pike, walleye, smallmouth, but also sucker species with a more northerly distribution, such as the white sucker and red horse as well, which form an important food source for the largest predatory fish in the river. So things are not going very well for central Iowa at the moment. And of course, another area where things have not been going very well for a long time is the Missouri River drainage in western Iowa. I think it goes back to some sort of government labor program that came out during the Great Depression that had as its goal to dredge a channel in the Missouri River in order to drain off floodwater more quickly and use more of the land in the river valley for farming. So a channel was dredged and wing dams were built in order to maintain that channel. And as a result, the main stem of the Missouri River, the current flows very fast. There's slack current behind the wing dams, but basically the natural structure of the river was permanently altered. Some of the native fish species declined, of course. Some, like short-nosed gar, probably increased. But then the introduction of invasive species led now to silver carp being probably the most common fish in the Missouri River. But there are also a lot of grass carp, and unlike the Mississippi River, there are no aquatic plants in this part of the Missouri River because of all the dredging. So they have had to turn to alternative food sources, such as insects, which means they will take a fly on the Missouri River much more readily than in bodies of water with large amounts of plants. So here I've hooked a small grass carp in the bottom of an eddy right above the next wing dam, and I've had to exit the kayak because the speed of the current increases right in that area to such a degree that I was not able to land the fish from the boat. So there it is, and like I said, it's not a big one for the average size of that population. And of course I didn't notice there was a giant drop of water on the lens. But very strong fish, and in that current they put up a real fight. And here you can see the grass carp has a terminal mouth as opposed to the subterminal mouth of a common carp or the superterminal mouth of a silver carp. There's a look at the fly. It's a damselfly larva pattern with bee chain eyes. And the fish was actually by this clump of grass. In between that clump of grass and the stump, there were two of them feeding there by lunging out of the water and grabbing leaves of grass and pulling them back into the water. The larger of the two spooked when I presented the fly, but the smaller one, which I hadn't seen, zipped up and ate it. So this is the next wing dam upstream, and again the exact same situation. Near the bottom of the eddy there was a clump of this grass which may itself be an invasive species, and the grass carp were lunging out of the water to grab the low-hanging leaves of that grass. Apparently there had been some rain up in the Dakotas or something that raised the river level just enough for them to get at that grass. I was on one side of the clump of grass, and I did sort of the overpowered curve cast, the sidearm curve cast, and I could feel the fish take the fly, so it was a little bit larger fish. The fight just went on and on and on. I won't show the whole thing here, but in that ripping current, it fought and fought and fought. And then I dropped it right as I was approaching the camera. The line tangled up. It's a wonder it didn't break the rod. It was only because the fish was exhausted, and needless to say, I was exhausted myself. But somehow managed not to break the rod, and still managed to have the fish on the hook. Fly fishing is just grown-ups playing with string. Finally, I wised up and just hand over handed it before the fish could completely revive. It was beginning to fight again, but I managed to grab it. Although I think I would prefer a more natural structure to the river. It can be a lot of fun going from eddy to eddy and targeting grass carp. I also lost I only managed to hook 2 that day, but I also lost another large grass carp, a smallmouth buffalo. I somehow managed to snag a silver carp while I was casting to some gar, and I lost what appeared to be a really colorfully spotted long-nosed gar too. So some interesting fish in there, although the native ecology, of course, has pretty much been destroyed. Alright, well, let's journey back to Lake Red Rock and look at some plants along the shoreline. This is the time of year when we're getting a lot of Asteraceae, or should I say, when the Asteraceae that have been there all year are flowering, and the Brassicaceae and Lamiaceae and so forth that were flowering earlier are done and beginning to die back. That was one of the Eupatorium species we flew over just a second ago. Looked like maybe some Erigeron or possibly Solidago mixed in there as well. Our first plant has the banner, wings, and keel flower morphology, and also the compound trifoliate leaf that is typical of the family Fabaceae, the legume family. But then I had to go one by one through the tribes and subtribes to finally figure out that this is Kumaroia striata, Japanese clover, although it only has a single flower as opposed to a cluster or flowering head. Our second plant does have a flowering head, and the flowers have the banner, wings, and keel morphology, as well as the compound trifoliate leaf, and I found it while searching for the previous plant because it's in the same subtribe, and this is roundhead bush clover, Lespedeza capitata. The flowers of our next plant are bilaterally symmetrical, appears to have fused petals and sort of a protruding lower lip. It also has the squarish stem and the opposite lanceolate leaves, so we're starting in order Lamiales, but you'll notice that unusual inflorescence is structured somewhat similar to a vervain, so we're beginning with family Verbenaceae, and this is Phyla lanceolata, the lance leaf frog fruit, so quite a name on that one. This next one was quite difficult to figure out. It has the bilaterally symmetrical flower, and it has these odd little seed capsules that somewhat resemble the Scrophularia we looked at in a previous episode. So I started in order Lamiales, but I had to go one by one through the families and the tribes to finally settle on slender false foxglove. Alright, as promised, let's dip into the Asteraceae. You might know this one as horseweed or Canadian fleabane. Canadian fleabane, eh? So you'll see it has the alternate lanceolate leaves, the big inflorescence, and even though the flowers are tiny, you can see that it is an Erigeron. This one, I believe, is Eupatorium serotinum, the late bone set, as opposed to the tall bone set. We have both in this area at this time, but the leaves don't quite have that sessile look, and the flower head is a little more compact. Either way, it has the 3 leaf veins. This one I thought was a false sunflower, but I had to carefully study the leaves on it and compare it carefully. I mean, you get into these giant plant families, there can be dozens of members blooming at the same time that look very similar. But I finally settled on Helianthus grossocerratus, the sawtooth sunflower. So it actually is a Helianthus. Fairly narrow leaves and that serrated margin make it a little bit unusual. Alright, well, let's wind this thing down with a little drone landing splashdown, how not to land a drone.